we'll do it first. All right, so we'll call ourselves to order. There are a couple of little housekeeping items that we have before we get into tonight's subject. One, at the previously concluded closed session, we took a roll call to certify that we did exactly what we were supposed to do according to the law, but we were not able to record Ms. Crystal's affirmative motion that nothing was discussed at the closed session that was not included in the motion to convene the closed session.
Aye.
All right, thank you. Is that recorded, Ms. Jacobs? Okay, another item. As part of our appointments from the Thursday recessed meeting of April, there was an omission from the Crystal City Citizens Review Council, and Ms. Garvey is putting forward the appointment of Brian Moore for a term ending April 30th, 2021. That was omitted from the roster that we approved on Thursday the 25th, so I'll make the motion. It does not need a second to approve Mr. Moore this evening. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it 5-0. Congratulations to Mr. Moore. And now on to the subject of tonight's conversation. This is our opportunity to annually commiserate with our Planning Commission as well as hear from the Planning Division about the upcoming fiscal year work plan. This is, it's now a somewhat recent innovation where we focused on really looking at the areas of work that the Planning Division is planning to pursue and balancing that with a number of areas that we would be interested in the Planning Division pursuing, realizing that there are many more of those areas than our resources to accomplish it within a fiscal year. So we purposefully have a conversation where we understand exactly what is intended in the year ahead and what might be some of the trade-offs that we would have to consider in order to accommodate any things that have emerged either from the Planning Commission or from the board or from CPHD staff themselves. So we'll have that conversation to understand what are the discretionary and non-discretionary items that are teed up for this year and really try and give some clear direction to the Planning Division about what are some of the trade-offs that we're willing to make in order to accommodate our fiscal year objectives. And then we also do want to have a focused conversation on the area around Pentagon City and specifically the Pentagon City Phase Development Site Plan, given the flurry of activity that we expect in that area that actually even predates the Amazon announcement. There are a number of areas of interest or expressions of interest from developers in that community about some development that causes us to take a look at the phase development site plan, and instead of doing it in an ad hoc basis, staff is going to put forward a proposal for us to maybe consider things more comprehensively. So that's the general subject, and we are thrilled to have the chair and the vice chair of the Planning Commission with us. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Schroll for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I do kind of want to say at the outset, as I did last time I was before you all, that we hope the next time the Planning Commission gets to have this work session with the county board, it is in that January, February timeframe to have more of an impact on the county budget. I understand this was a different year, but I hope going forward that we can kind of return to that calendar. That being said, we do have some comments for you all based on the presentation that Mr. Duffy will give momentarily. On the PDSP for Pentagon City, which you just mentioned, Mr. Dorsey, we do support kind of a broad planning effort, whether that is a PDSP or small area plan. I don't want to presuppose what staff may determine, but we do think having a broader planning effort is something that would be appropriate as opposed to looking at it just site by site. And, you know, there are some remaining questions. How, you know, what are the boundaries that we look at? I know that's in Mr. Duffy's conversation this evening. How long would that process be? Who should be participating in that conversation? Likely not just planning commissioners. We probably think it needs to be a broader group, but we don't presume to know at this moment who should be at that table. So those are some big questions to ask, even before we get to things about density, height, where, you know, where are we going? And we also don't want to presume at this point what that output needs to look like. But you know, we're open to these types of conversations. We also want to mention the kind of public facilities comp plan element. The Planning Commission for a while has been in full support of developing an element of the comp plan that would address public facilities, mainly because of what we perceive is a not fulsome planning for our schools. Schools are taking up, as the county manager knows, more of the budget. We're having increased enrollment, and so we need to get ahead of our public facilities planning and our schools planning. And so we would certainly support that. We also note that the lack of planning on that does create other conflicts with other elements of our comp plan. We just recommended, and you all just adopted the recent update to the Public Spaces Master Plan, which calls for an increase in our public spaces. And so schools often can be in conflict with that. And so having a proper planning process, I think, can help us navigate that and some of the other conflicts that may arise. Last thing on my list, the urban design and research team, part of the planning division, does a lot of great work. They're involved in a number of matters, site plans. They manage the PFRC process. And they're a fantastic asset. They're just pulled in a lot of different directions right now. And so as we go forward in future budgets, I think that would be something to flag for you all, that it's a small team, but they kind of do a lot of work for the county. And so we would encourage you all to think about, they're down a person in that office. Think about in future budgets, maybe trying to add that staff capacity back. So I'll conclude there. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and certainly happy to answer any questions.
All right, terrific. Stay tuned. Ms. Guerin, you have something to say at this time?
I just want to echo those three highlighted areas, reiterating that the Planning Commission would support the efforts of the county leadership and the planning staff to re-examine visions for any areas, not just the one that you're talking about, that are facing a lot of growth and where our visions might be changing to accommodate that, and where there's community support and we can refine this with data and input and guidance from our other adopted or accepted plans and policies. So in general, we would support that. I don't think this will be the only area we see. And then again, in support of Mr. Schroll's idea of considering moving the idea of a long-range facilities planning work program, your attachment 6 on page 20, to a higher priority. Because again, I think what we're seeing is that we all recognize schools has this long-term increasing capacity issue. It's projected, we've seen it, and this year we saw how that results in a greater share of the budget for the schools. And as Mr. Schroll said, we're also seeing this need for the space in terms of relocatables located on the schools in double digits for years and years. That's at odds with our Public Spaces Master Plan to preserve our open space and our facilities at Williamsburg. They don't even have tennis courts anymore. So I think that we could give them the benefit of some planning expertise and leadership in terms of how to move forward with maybe a comp plan element that works with the rest of our comp plan elements, and give some guidance as to where those schools go in the future and how we accommodate that increased capacity.
Thank you. So while it won't really be the subject of much of what we discussed tonight, I'll just assure you that Ms. Garvey and I, when we meet with our school board colleagues, will take a temperature and see to the extent that this is something that fits with their plans and see what the follow-up steps will be. But on to county stuff. Let's focus on what Mr. Duffy has in mind.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, good evening to the county board members and members of our Planning Commission. For the record, I'm Robert Duffy, Planning Director with Arlington County's Department of Community Planning, Housing Development. We have some of our senior staff with me tonight. Aaron Schreiber, Richard Tucker, Chris Kreider, Matt Matuzik, and Matt Ladd are all here tonight, and they have major roles to play, certainly within the work program that we'll discuss tonight. So I'm very pleased to have them with me to respond to any questions we might have. Just an overview of what I'm going to cover tonight. We prepared a report that has been distributed both to the county board and to the Planning Commission that is in several parts. There's an overview. Most importantly, there's a organization and staffing presentation for the planning division. There's an overview of our 2019 and 2020 Planning Division work program, which I'll go through in great detail. Because of limited resources, there are certainly some projects these are the trade-offs, Mr. Chairman, that you mentioned. Some projects that we recommend the board consider deferring until FY21, or some that maybe have reduced scope for this upcoming fiscal year. And so again, those are trade-offs we'll discuss. And then the report provides some more detail about the discretionary projects that we've included in our work program, and one new potential project that we'll go into in greater detail is the opportunity to revisit our Pentagon City PDSP and prepare an update for parts of that. So an overview of what I'm going to cover tonight in the presentation and contained in the report. Let me really begin, though, and talk about our staff. As you've heard me say many times before, we're very fortunate in Arlington County to have an outstanding team of professionals and administrative staff. While we have 3 sections, current planning, comprehensive planning, urban design, and research, today we work across those sectional lines. We work with our other divisions in the department, and certainly across with our colleagues in the other departments in the county. It truly is a collaborative process. I have the great honor every day to work with this team of professionals that make a difference for the future of Arlington County. Just a little bit overview on our staffing. As you know, the budget the county board adopted brings us 1 new principal planner that will help us with the development review side, major site plan efforts, and that position will be working with Aaron Schreiber. We do have some vacancies, but we're in the process of filling those fairly rapidly. Just this past week, we filled a new position, a planning tech position, that's going to play a critical role in Permit Arlington. This position is going to lead and manage the intake of all future applications related to the work we do in the planning side. So it's a major new effort that will require some orientation and onboarding in coordination with our interdepartmental Permit Arlington report. We have several other vacancies, 2 associate planners that we're going to be interviewing for in May, and they should be filled by June. And again, a principal planner position that we'll advertise in May as well. So the next slide really is an organizational chart, and it's important to see how our 32 staff members today are organized, and their work focuses on both comp planning, current planning, and urban design. But again, I want to stress that we work across these sectional lines and work as a team on most projects. And when I go through the projects, both the discretional and non-discretional, again, I'll touch on some of those areas where collaboration and ongoing engagement occurs. But again, I just want to note that how important and how fortunate we are in Arlington to have this great team of professional planners that works with us every day. Again, I just want to cover some major accomplishments that are important to note. Some of them really lead to this upcoming work program. We completed the 4-mile run planning process, which Richard Tucker played a key role with in leading that effort. We also worked, as you know, very closely with the Department of Parks and Recreation with the Jenny Dean Master Park. We've had a great and highly successful and engaged beginning of the Lee Highway planning process through the work of Natasha Afonso Ahmed. We're off to a great start. We're doing some things differently there. You know, we have a sort of a satellite planning office is focused on with the Lee Highway Alliance office that brings our staff out to the community periodically. Housing conservation districts, as the board will hear in the coming weeks and the community will learn, we've completed a great deal of work on this effort. This involves both planning staff and housing staff, and David Christile is here this evening working on some new tools that will ensure that we can address housing production and preservation successfully in those 12 areas of Arlington County. That's a critical part of Housing Arlington, which David Christile and the manager presented last week, We're going to be very involved in that. We were very actively involved in creation of the work program, and we're going to be providing some support as well as playing a lead role in a number of the various programs and projects there. Our zoning ordinance amendments, we had a full plate of amendments that we were able to bring to the Planning Commission and County Board through the work that Nick Rogers did in leading that. The Child Care Initiative with Kim Vaca and the work she did with DHS. She's just been a great addition to our team, and we'll talk more about the future of the Child Care Initiative in our work program. Special GLUB studies in process. As you know, we had some very challenging GLUB studies last year, which led us to develop a new process, which led to a new fee structure, which the board adopted as part of the budget, and we'll be putting that new process in play by July 1st of 2019. In terms of the RAPS work, I think the board recognizes that we were fortunate to receive an award from the National Capital Chapter of the American Planning Association for the major development efforts and planning that led to the mixed-use project at RAPS. 2020 census. This is one of the most important projects and efforts that we'll undertake, and we'll talk more about that process going forward. But as one of the early phases of this in 2018, Christine Sanders and Elizabeth Hardy put together a great new tool for Arlington County, and that's a multifamily address file that we did not have. It's required by the census this year, and again, it's a major tool to support a number of projects and programs across the county organization. We completed a number of major site plan applications through the work of Aaron and his major site plan team, as well as work that Nicole Bowling did in terms of our site plan coordinator. And again, I want to recognize the SPRC Citizens Guide, which was a major effort by Jane Siegel, working with Nicole Bowling. And again, it's a tremendous asset for the SPRC, which is really a fundamental part of our major site plan work. So just a few major accomplishments. And again, all of this work, staff can't be successful with unless we have a great and working collaboration with our citizen planners, with the Planning Commission, and that's going to be equally as important this next year in this work program as we move forward. So I want to move on and provide an overview of the work program items themselves. Let me just talk about the categories that we divided the work program that's on Table 1, which we'll move to shortly. This was a challenging budget year, and it was important that we define our work program in two categories, what I'll call non-discretionary. Those are projects and programs that are required by county ordinance, state statute, or other provisions of law, if you will. Major site plan work, use permits, architectural and landscape plan review, just the three of them that fall into this important category. The discretionary program, they're not required, certainly, by any county standard or regulation or legislation or state legislation, but they're important parts of our planning work program. And again, the intention of including projects in this category was not to minimize their priority, but to recognize there are things that we elect to do. There are projects that the county board elects to recommend that we proceed with. The Lee Highway planning effort is a good example, and the 4 Mile Run Valley planning that we completed is another very good example. But it was important this year to include our projects and programs in these two categories, again, to demonstrate where some of our core services lie, and secondly, to recognize, again, while we have 3 sections, that we work across those lines on these two categories of work. So I'm going to go over very quickly using Table 1 that's part of your report and is on the screen in terms of the non-discretionary projects. And I'm going to highlight these and try to quantify, in some cases qualify, what each of these means. Again, the major site plans, I think the board and the Planning Commission have seen a table that Aaron Schreiber and his staff have put together that looks at where we are in terms of final, preliminary, and anticipated plans. While it is a significant volume of work and future development, our staff has been preparing for that for well over a year in terms of how we organize our staff, assign resources, the process and procedures we put in place. And I want to commend Aaron Schreiber for the work he's done in leading that effort. This year, we'll see County Board and the Planning Commission will see 10 to 12 major site plan applications. Probably there'll be 15 to 18 that we'll see over the next 2 years. It'll be coming through that multi-phase process of review. In terms of use permits, both new and renewal, major part of our work program, we have a number of associate planners who focus on the 150 to over 168 applications and renewals of use permits that we anticipate during this period of time. And of course, 2 major types of use permits deal with APS and public facilities. In terms of the APS, Arlington Public School projects, the Ed Center, and certainly the Career Center are 2 major projects. Fire Station 8, which just initiated the PFRC process, will also fall in that category. We also review a number of minor site plan amendments that, under the zoning ordinance, enable the zoning administrator to administratively approve these amendments because of their size and scope. We anticipate up to 60 to 70 of these during this next year. Administrative change applications, these are very minor revisions that involve changes to facades or other features. There are about 230 of these in total that we will work on during the course of a year, and about 116 of those involve architectural and landscape plan review. And again, most of these are very minor changes, both in terms resulting from maintenance and again, through Chris Kreider's leadership and the work of Brett Wallace and Laura Schaub, our 2 landscape architects and urban design professionals, they do an outstanding job in advising us with that work. We'll continue to review the standard site plan, the 4.1 conditions and the form-based code conditions. While we may go into a biannual cycle rather than annual cycle on this due to the work program requirements. Most importantly, the work that we do to support the Planning Commission is critically important, whether it be staffing the commission itself through Giselle Johnson as the county clerk, Nicole Bowling as the Planning Commission coordinator, but also the work with the 3 standing subcommittees, the Long Range Planning Committee, the Site Plan Review Committee, and the Zoning Committee. All of those require ongoing staff support, and again, the level of collaboration, coordination between staff and the Planning Commission is just essential, particularly as we move forward with this work program. We'll continue to administer the Columbia Pike Force-Based Code applications and any minor amendments. Greenbrier Apartments and Westmont are the 2 that are on the immediate horizon. Permit Arlington, where we played a major role, particularly in the current planning section, in supporting this important conversion of our permitting system to better serve our applicants and our citizens. And again, as I said, we're going to be transferring the application, intake of the applications during 2019 to the Planning Division, and we'll have staff working both on the 10th floor as well as the 7th floor to administer that process. A number of comprehensive plan updates and amendments. Recently, the bicycle element was considered by the board, as well as the Public Spaces Master Plan. We anticipate another amendment to the Master Transportation Plan, and later in the cycle, the Affordable Housing Master Plan will be subject to review. I talked a little bit about special GLUP studies. We currently have 2 applications pending. The special GLUP study for Shirlington will begin very shortly, and we'll complete that by the end of the year. And we have a second study for the Days Inn property at 2201 Arlington Boulevard. And to date, those are the applications that we have. Those are not subject to the special the new guideline, the new procedures that staff has developed based on the new application schedule the board approved. And again, we'll be working on the Shirlington study very shortly. And lastly, some work that sometimes goes unnoticed, but the county receives a number of notices by the state, other local governments, by the federal government, various actions, plans, capital budgets, and improvements that we have to respond to and review as your planning staff. Also provide a notice to the manager and county staff as well as to the community. And Leon Vines does an excellent job of coordinating that effort. So brief overview of our non-discretionary projects. I've included in the presentation, and I won't go into this in detail, we can come back to it, but again, this is the current table of final, preliminary, and anticipated site plans. Those where you see potential dates, again, match up with the conclusion that we've reached that we'll see anywhere from 10 to 12 actual plans moving to the County Board of Planning Commission during the course of this year. But again, I have to say that this level of new site plan growth and applications we haven't seen for a while. But again, we're well prepared to work with these applicants and manage the process that's so important for the future of Arlington. I want to move on to the discretionary projects. And again, these are the projects that, while not required under any county ordinance or state statute, are all very important in their own right. And leading off with the 2020 census, I've talked a little bit about the address work that our staff did. Elizabeth Hardy, our chief demographer, is working with the county manager's office, also working closely with COG, the Complete Count Committee, to ensure that come April 1st, 2020, we will have a complete count that's so important for federal funding and certainly other means for Arlington County. So this is a high priority, and we have a team in place that will ensure we strive towards a complete count. The Lee Highway planning effort, again, is being led by Natasha, and again, during the course of this year, we'll complete an existing conditions report. We have a draft of that we're just preparing to discuss with the working group and the community. We'll begin to finalize a vision and some preliminary goals, and we'll begin the process of developing preliminary scenarios, growth and land use scenarios, and proceeding towards an early concept plan for that process. So over the next year and a half, we'll make significant progress with the Lee Highway initiative. The 4 Mile Run planning effort, as you know, this year we were scheduled to begin the GLUP amendments and zoning work. We're recommending that we defer that effort until FY21, in part because work is still progressing on the cultural district plan, which will be informative for that future zoning. We'll continue to work closely with AED as they develop that cultural arts plan. But again, one of the trade-offs will be that work on the zoning and GLUP amendment be postponed until FY21. On the child care initiative, again, working with DHS, we completed a number of major projects, including new zoning regulations, new definitions, new procedures that ensure family daycare users can expand and provide those necessary services for Arlington County. And again, I recognize the work that Kim Vaca did with that important part of our work program. One of the trade-offs, again, we're recommending that our work on Phase 2, which would focus on providing incentives for our site plan projects, mixed use, commercial, residential, higher and dense density developments in Arlington County, incentives to provide those types of facilities on site. We believe that we can continue those efforts, but we'd like to, we've recommended that that effort be deferred until FY21. Housing Arlington, we can go into some more detail, but again, we're working very closely with the Housing Division. We're going to be working on the faith-based initiative and the partnership work, working on the missing middle piece. I can describe some of these pieces in more detail later, but that effort in conjunction with the housing conservation effort is going to be a major part of our work program. Long-range public facilities planning, our focus there is on developing a scope of work in a number of areas, and we can go through that in a little more detail as well this evening. There are a number of zoning ordinance amendments, and I'll come to these in a second when we get to the following table. We have been providing staff support for HQ2 and for 22202 planning in terms of providing intermental planning support with our current planning section as well as an interdepartmental team. Again, as we'll discuss later this evening, there is a major new project that we're proposing that the county board consider that would examine the potential to update the Pentagon City Phase Development Site Plan. We produce annually a very important report on Arlington's demographics and economic conditions called the Profile. This has been an annual document. We are still going to produce that, but we're going to produce it in a new form. We've been working with some assistance with Virginia Tech to look at how best to format that document, make it even more user-friendly, and what categories of data we can include in the forecast, and you'll be seeing an example of that very shortly. So we're transforming Profile into what historically has been a paper document into really an online interactive, I think, document that'll be very important for the future. Our demographic staff continues to work with APS staff as a result of the community facilities study on assisting APS with student enrollment projections. We provide the demographic forecasts as well as age cohort data that's so important for that, and we've developed a strong working partnership with APS demographic staff to make sure that that continues to happen. The Joint Facilities Advisory Committee, or JFAC, we're going to continue to ensure we support the mission of JFAC and focus on several areas which will involve long-range capital facilities planning, some visioning and community outreach for that effort, and some ongoing short-term capital project and planning review that are all part of that core mission of JFACs. We have continued to staff the Public Facilities Review Committee. We're about to start review of Fire Station 8. And again, our urban design team, Chris Kreider and Brett Wallace, are very actively involved with the chair in that project. Again, there are two other support areas, committee support areas that we are actively involved with. The Crystal City Citizen Review Commission, which meets on a bi-monthly or quarterly basis. We continue to staff that through Margaret Tulloch Rhodes. And NAOP support, we have 10 or 11 meetings convened to coordinate with NAOP on an ongoing basis. So just to highlight the discretionary projects, on the next slide, table 3 in the report, again, these are the zoning ordinance amendments that we've included in our work program. Several of these we've accomplished since this report was produced earlier. Phase 1 of the child care initiative, family daycare, is now in place as of March. Large media screens is in April 2013. Dormitory social service use changes to the parking ratios in April. RC zoning district regulations in April as well. And coming up in May with the board to deal with school capacity, the new relocatable regulations will be before the board in May. A number of our zoning amendments will focus on housing Arlington, as we note by the table. The detached accessory dwellings, which the board considered the RTA recently, again, will be up before the board in May. We're working on the bonus density cap. This says the RTA in June and action in July. That will occur in the fall now, and we'll correct that schedule shortly. We will look at low, moderate income housing definition. However, this is not a high priority, and this may be another zoning ordinance trade-off that we'll discuss tonight. We've been working on elder care residential zoning modifications, and it also deals with assisted living. Again, our ordinance does not truly enable or address these types of facilities. So we're working with a number of interests to update those sections of the zoning ordinance. Housing conservation districts, I've talked a little bit about. We're continuing to work on, we'll begin to work on an enabling piece of legislation later this year. And most importantly, the missing middle, which we're developing a scope of work for with David Castillo and his housing staff. Columbia Pike Form-Based Code, there are a number of amendments that will be coming forward. And finally, on the list, we are scheduled to address some amendments to deal with public facilities in the S3A and PS. We may have to recommend that this be deferred as another item to trade off given the PDSP discussion that we'll have tonight. So in terms of more detail on each of these discretionary projects, in the report, there's a series of 9 attachments that go into much greater detail than I've been able to cover this evening. We can come back to these, and I can provide more detail later in the program. But as I said earlier, in addition to recommending the discretionary and non-discretionary projects, there are some projects that we have recommended that the board consider either reducing in scope during this fiscal year or deferring until FY21. And 3 of the major zoning ordinance amendments deal with phase 2 of the child care regulations, the 4 Mile Run Valley Plan implementation, which involves both GLUP and zoning amendments, an additional amendment to address school construction. These involve interior improvements and the issue of design capacity, which is part of our zoning ordinance. There are a number of other ordinance amendments dealing with telecom, parking, sign ordinance that we're recommending not be addressed this period of 2019 to 20. Some GIS mapping that we normally do. We're going to be working with DES's GIS staff to determine whether we can transfer some of those responsibilities there. While we'd like to provide a great high level of support to implement POPs during this next work program cycle, we're going to be somewhat limited based on some of the other priorities that I've covered this evening. And lastly, while we'll continue to collect the data and examine development tracking in our metro corridors and across Arlington County, we won't produce the actual monthly, quarterly, and annual reports. What we're going to do is track that data, develop that data, and work closely with Arlington Economic Development to prepare a new annual report that will include an annual fiscal impact report as well. We're now working with AED on finalizing that scope and developing the timeline and process for moving forward. We'll be reporting that effort back to the county manager and the county board in the coming months. But this project is being led by AED, and again, our demographic staff will be very involved with this. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to pause there, and again, I'm going to put the table back up on the screen that outlines both the non-discretionary and discretionary projects if the board and the planning commissioners would like to discuss some of these in more detail.
Thank you, Mr. Duffy. So at this point, be in order for us to get a better understanding of what are some of the trade-offs implied and presented by Mr. Duffy this evening. Any concerns about the areas of work? Turn it first to my colleagues, starting with Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Duffy, actually, if you put it back on 12 where we left off, and what you're proposing that we reduce in scope or not do this year, postpone, I guess a question that occurs to me on, some of the amendments, are some of these, because some of these look like actually an effort to become more efficient, so that if we work them through, we'll be able to it'll be a little more efficient to do the work, making it less stressful on staff and everyone. Is that the case? And if so, which ones would actually save time if we manage to go through them?
There are a wide range of reasons why these have been identified as work program items, and I'm going to pick out several.
Well, what I was interested, which are the ones that are, I suppose maybe they're all to make things more efficient,
They will, and certainly some of them are driven by actual changes in state legislation that require us to no longer permit certain telecommunications facilities. Your point is to number 9, major and minor site plan amendment clarifications, to help clarify, again, how we categorize and process those amendments. There are several others that have been on our work list for some time, frankly. The parking modifications, again, a major piece of work. It grows out of the office and residential parking policies and guidelines that the board's adopted. I want to point out a major piece of work that we've included. Ultimately, we're going to have to step back and proceed with some major amendments to our zoning ordinance that deals with the siting and operation of various public facilities. That, and working with DES, this is going to require a fairly extensive amount of engagement, community engagement, as well as research and related work with several county agencies. So it's,
Let me try a few specific, if I could. So like for APS, interior improvements and design capacity, is that simply to try to make some things sort of codify a little bit their administrative, and instead of coming to us or to you for permission, if you will, or get it, it's something that they sort of do more automatically? Is that the sort of thing this is?
This is a good example of that. This would also provide some of that ability, but again, it requires a major amendment to the zoning ordinance. There's a link to the capital improvement program here as well. So
Okay.
They vary, I guess, is the
Okay.
best answer.
All right, thank you. And then one more question, if I might.
Sure.
So at the last one, the publication of the tracking reports, and I guess this almost might be more for the manager, does this fall into, open data so that while we're not assembling and producing the reports, if someone wanted that data, they could get it from us, from us, so that, because I suppose there are people that want that data, but we don't want to have to put it in a nice report form all the time.
Yes,
Okay, so, and we would be doing that.
yes. We'll
Okay.
continue to collect the data because it's essential.
And we'd make it available, that's my,
Yes.
yes, thank you.
But lose the narrative. That's the trade-off.
The
The
narrative.
trade-off is that we would be getting rid of the narrative.
For now,
Right.
until we produce the revised report format and content.
Just want to make sure that's what we're focused on. All right, Mr. Gutschall.
Thank you. Is it possible, could we go to table 1, anywhere where it shows the non-discretionary versus discretionary? That's fine. So I was curious on this one, why wouldn't standard site plan and form-based code conditions update be considered discretionary? Like the other ones, I can see how, because somebody comes forward with an application, we have to respond to the application.
It's a good question, and there are a couple that you could argue kind of in the gray area, but because the site plan, major site plan review and so forth is ordained by the zoning ordinance, these are administrative conditions that are called for by the zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance says we will develop a set of standards that make up the 4.1 requirements that the county manager approves or updates every year.
Sure. Is this referring to, though, this is just the kind of the annual review or periodic review of our standard site plan conditions?
We have started to do this on an annual basis. However, we've done some fairly major reviews recently. We may go to a biannual review because I think we're in a better place than we were 3 years ago when we started this annual review.
Okay. Thank you. So I wanted to ask on the zoning ordinance amendments. I don't think you have the slide on it, but in the paper version of your report, I guess your work plan, there's a table that breaks out the different categories of zoning ordinance amendment, and you have the condensed versus the other ones. Oh, I'm sorry, I've lost my spot on that. And I wanted to understand where in here would be the type of zoning ordinance amendments that aren't necessarily anticipated. We've had in the past things come up because either the zoning administrator changes a determination or some little nuance is discovered in the code that really do I think in the past, if past is prologue, have presented a sort of urgency to them. But I noticed that in Table 4 and what is not recommended for this work plan, you have technical amendments and corrections. So if you could just speak to, in general, I know you're presenting to us what you anticipate, but how will we handle what might not be anticipated, or is there any wiggle room for emerging priorities of the board? And in particular, I'm interested in those things on that condensed level of review that we can kind of generally take the temperature and all agree this is what we really need to do, but of course we still want to go through the process just to make sure we don't uncover any consequences.
Thank you, board member. Just to go back to the core of the question about this condensed process, last year the board asked us to address the process and procedures for zoning ordinance amendments. We put them in these 3 categories. This condensed process, which allows us to deal with things very nimbly and very quickly, if you will. Short-term review process with more of a middle range term and more of a longer range study. And so that's how we characterize these zoning ordinance amendments. We have built some capacity into our work program this year to tackle some of those. An example of one that we recently picked up, if you recall, we found that there was an issue that one of our care providers needed to occupy several beds that they'd have approval for, but they couldn't meet our parking standards. And so we discussed this with the applicant and made a decision. We had to more rapidly modify the code, have an abbreviated process, and bring that to the board. So we will have capacity to deal with some technical corrections if they're really warranted. The zoning administrator advises us that we have to proceed with them, and some other very limited capacity to tackle some other amendments. But again, the work program this year is tighter, I think, in terms of the bandwidth that we have on this front. It's not only our zoning coordinator position that works on these, but many of other staff are engaged with these zoning ordinance amendments as well. So we have to position staff differently to meet some of these work program demands.
Well, I appreciate that answer, and I will accept that as kind of satisfactory for that we have some capacity. I will just say for myself, Mr. Manager, when we look at next year and the work plan and the budget, let's see how it goes this year, but I'm wondering if we don't need to look at, I think we're going to increasingly find with everything that we're doing that there's a lot in the zoning ordinance that we're going to want to unpack, and I would think that we might need some additional staffing to even more staffing to go specifically towards kind of I could see where we would get to a regular review cycle where we are whether it's every 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, we've got a batch of relatively minor amendments, but they're just constantly moving through, and we're constantly reviewing them and constantly approving them, because I think that there's a lot in the zoning ordinance that we continue to uncover here and there, and I have a feeling that that's going to snowball the more that we dig into the ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal.
Yeah, I just to begin, really agree with Mr. Gutschall's comments, and just to put a finer point on it for anybody who might be following along, right? These are things like recognizing last year that our zoning ordinance was the obstacle that prevented the realization of a community pool in the Knock neighborhood, right? A use that was roundly welcomed, and our obstacle was sort of buried deep in that document. So I think it's worth kind of putting a name to it, right? What Mr. Gutschall's talking about, these are not major, large-scale changes that will affect every property in Arlington. They're relatively modest, and yet we want to do a good and thorough job on them. So we strongly support what Mr. Gutschall said, and perhaps the biggest issue there is just talking about it in context of a budget for next year, making sure that the department is adequately staffed for what will likely be more of those. Our zoning ordinance isn't getting any younger, right? So one big question and one little one. The first is with regard, the larger one, the balancing the priorities of our research team and community data forecasting with Census 2020. So, Mr. Duffy, you did a good job, and I know the Attachment 1 does a good job of outlining that our research team within the planning department is really spearheading this, which is exciting, and I think they bring an exciting level of professional expertise. Nevertheless, I'm sort of struck reading this that a lot of this is almost what we would expect out of our communications and public engagement team. A lot of the work ahead, which we are very enthusiastic about, is really about educating people, mobilizing people, doing that community outreach. Again, I think our research team is well qualified to do that, but I was sort of struck looking through elsewhere in the planning work plan that comes at a cost, and actually might come at the cost of our 30-year forecast, our quarterly development report, which I know this board has gotten increasingly interested in, and I think more members of our community might. Could you talk a little bit about how, and this is probably a question for the manager because it's about cross-departmental priority balancing. So, Mr. Manager, if you could start, and then to the extent Mr. Duffy, Mr. Williamson, Ms. Byrd have comments about how, why you feel comfortable saying the 30-year forecast and quarterly development report work is okay to defer or ramp down.
So I had that exact conversation a few days ago with Elizabeth Hardy and Bryna Helfer, who are the co-staff leads for the Census 2020 effort. And I encourage Mr. Duffy or other people to add. Elizabeth has had conversations with her colleagues in the region and also with the Council of Governments about whether there'll be the work on a substantial update to the regional forecast. And there's some question at the COG level, given the fact that every jurisdiction is now in the same place we are, about whether the regular update is going to happen. It might be deferred till actually we get the results of the 2020 count, so that it will provide some more information for us to do a more thorough analysis. And you are correct to note that a big piece of the work is related to public engagement. And so that's, Brian is going to, at some point over the next month or two, transition to working on that almost full time. And so I've said to Elizabeth, and I've said to Claude and Bob and Samia, that that's going to need to be Elizabeth's primary focus, and to the extent that we need to bring in other resources from the outside to help, we would do that. But since Elizabeth is by herself right now on that, I wouldn't want to bring in people from the outside that she then needed to spend time supervising. So it is a trade-off and a tension that you correctly pointed out.
And can I follow up on that, Ms. Crystal? Because it's the exact area that I wanted to explore. I'm interested to hear that the cooperative round might be put off, and if it's until after we get the results of the decennial, we're talking being put off for a while.
Well, it could be put off till sometime much later in calendar year 2020, and I'm way beyond my depth on that one, so.
All right, I'll work on that on the COG level. But beyond that, it does invite the question. The one thing we can't say about the decennial census is that it snuck up on us. And so the question comes as to why we weren't prepared for, the need to have this conversation about trade-offs. Were there any other alternatives explored about staffing up prior to, so that we weren't left in a position of needing to pull people off of other things that we deem priorities?
I think, as you know, in the budget, the manager and the board's now approved significant dollars that can provide supporting resources. We've spent a great deal of time with our research team and with our communications team discussing what that process is. It's one of the attachments that you have. We're very confident that while Elizabeth will be spending 65% of her time, which is a major carve-out. And I can't say enough about the work that she does and how our research and demographic team has elevated itself, not only in the department and in the county, but in Northern Virginia and the region, in terms of the work they do and lead the Northern Virginia Demographers Network and the work we do with COG. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, Elizabeth certainly recently served on the panel on the Complete Count Committee. On terms of the forecasting, we did recent work, and Mr. Chairman, on the housing work we've been doing as planning directors and housing directors. We did some short-term forecasting in terms of build-out numbers and capacity for future housing production over and above, and research staff was very helpful with that. And again, there was some anticipation there might be around 9.3, but we don't think that's going to be the case. So I think we're prepared and we're in a good position.
And if I could just follow up before turning it back over to Ms. Crystal, I do have a concern about our relying on open data as a way to deliver some of these key data points in terms of development tracking that does presume a certain facility with data, which may not necessarily be shared by everyone in the community. And I'm not even speaking about losing control of the narrative and people getting it wrong. I'm talking about access. There may be people for whom that's just not accessible, and I'm really concerned that when it comes to key data points like our overall profile or development tracking, that we're essentially excluding some segment of our community from really being able to fully understand that. So I'd encourage our rethinking that.
What I'd like to do, Mr. Chairman, is provide a brief report to the county manager on how we'll ensure that we continue to provide that access. That's important.
Thank you.
Actually, that was the question I wanted to ask and follow up, Mr. Chair. So the plan, because I wanted to ask, and you may have discovered a footnote in the work plan that I missed, but the quarterly development plan will still be published, but in the form of open data, or it is simply up to our citizens who are interested in the development data to pull it out of the open data portal?
Based on what we're hearing from the board tonight, I want to step back, provide the manager with.
Okay.
I get the understanding now, and we will ensure that we don't skip a beat in terms of providing this data, but it just won't be in these refined reports that we release. We'll make sure it's accessible. Let us get back to you with a report on that.
And you should take our concern as a compliment, because we value that report greatly. And I think actually we've started to put even more weight on it as members of our community have gotten more interested. We've long wrestled with this question of the impacts of development, et cetera. And I know we've talked increasingly about using that quarterly development report as a vehicle to say this is how we look back and how we know that the development we're approving is not overwhelming our infrastructure, which is often a concern in the community. So I'd hate for us to lose that resource, just as we all as a community and board are really fully understanding its value.
I think you'll also be excited in terms of the new format and the approach to profile and some of this reporting that we're developing. So let us report back on that, because we hear you.
All right.
And then I have just one smaller thing, which is to say, recognize the deferral of the childcare phase 2. As much as I hate to take our foot off the gas of that, we've nevertheless achieved some excellent things, as you noted, Mr. Duffy, and I think that makes sense relative to some other priorities. Just wanted to confirm, I know that the Department of Human Services, which has really been kind of our lead agency on the overall childcare initiative, will be continuing to convene the working group and the leadership team. Ms. Vaca will still be available to participate in that and kind of give the planning perspective as issues present themselves. It's just that we won't be moving forward with the zoning ordinance amendments to facilitate bonus density, et cetera.
And they will come back shortly in FY21. Okay. You're right, board member. Kim will continue to provide support, and Kim Vaca is going to play an important role in housing Arlington. And she's doing work right now on the bonus density work, and I think you'll be equally impressed with the work that she produces there.
So our head will be right in that space to jump back in when child care phase 2 is on the agenda in 21. All right, thank you so much.
Beautiful. Mr. DeFerranti?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a couple of questions about the telecommunications piece that it fell out. Just reading the report, you'd still comply with all state law. It's just codifying those changes is what would be delayed. Is that right?
That's correct.
Got it. And none of this, just so that I understand, maybe this is a little bit for the manager, but none of this would stop or prevent us from moving forward with the small cell franchise agreement update that would move forward. That's a separate area, body of work, but delaying this would not prevent that from moving forward?
That work has been with DES, and they've been very actively involved with that.
Great. And then the only other thing I would say, just in line with the questioning that Ms. Crystal had, it is an extraordinarily full work plan. I'm really glad to hear that you're working on those additional hires and additional positions. And certainly we'll have a discussion in the Pentagon's, the next discussion will focus on that. But I would also just signal that I certainly, if there's something that is so critical where there's an additional need for a slight amount of funding or one-time funding, at least I would want to signal that I might be open to that conversation.
All right, thank you. Any comments on this? Oh, Mr. Gutschall, and then I'll see if Ms. Guerin or Mr. Schroll have any questions on this portion.
Ms. Crystal just reminded me, and I think it is worthwhile to point out, since Mr. Schroll and the Planning Commission pointed out the intersection between our planning and schools planning, that attachment 9 to the work plan is a Joint Facilities Advisory Commission work program, and then that there is also, I forget what the attachment number is, but there's an attachment for a long-range, attachment 6, thank you, a long-range public facility planning scoping exercise that's going to happen this year, and I think there's going to be a lot more to come on that effort, so I just wanted to point that out because I think that the board has heard you, and we are definitely moving in the direction of joint planning with schools.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, I was nudging Mr. Gutschall because I was saying, we're hearing from the Planning Commission again about the schools comp plan element, and that's been an interest of mine too. I think, and really a lot of credit goes to Mr. Gutschall and Mr. DeFerenti as our current liaisons to JFAC, along of course with staff, for trying to come up with a scope to figure out what the right product is rather than starting with the product and ending with a scope. So all of which is to say, thus far, I have felt that itch as acutely as the Planning Commission has. This has for the time being scratched it, and so I wanted to make sure to elevate because, as Mr. Gutschall says, we have heard you, and as our kind of best minds on long-range planning and comp plan, really appreciated it.
If I might, Mr.
Please
Mr.
go right ahead.
Yeah, we certainly are happy to be hopefully on the verge of having this conversation. As I noted, I think it's long overdue. I think my Planning Commission colleagues and I, though, do believe that it should be an element of the comp plan. And so I know there are people around this table and maybe members of their staff that don't want to presume what it should be, but I think the Planning Commission believes that it needs to hold that weight as an element of the comp plan to help us in our planning efforts. And so we don't want to presume what it should contain other than that, but I think that it does need to be at that level to be taken seriously in our planning conversations. So we look forward to it and continuing this conversation. And I will say that having had a conversation or two with some of the county school board members, they seem to be kind of open to this. I think they're, I don't want to speak for all of them, obviously, but in my conversations, I think they want to find when the right time to have that conversation would be. The challenge is there's never a right time to have it because we're always facing new school facilities coming online. And so I think we kind of delay this at our own peril, and not having that tool, I think, creates some other challenges for us that if we kind of buckle down and do some of this work, we might have some additional tools to help us consider where public facilities and specifically schools should be going.
Just caution us all that since the school board has not weighed in on this issue as the school board, this is one side of the conversation, one side of a much larger conversation. I just, not to criticize anybody in the room, but people listening at home may think that the ball is in this court to decide whether to move forward, and it's not. Okay. Anything else from this piece? All right, Mr. Duffy, back to you.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. This effort is currently not part of our 2019-20 work program. but planning staff believe we're at a important point in the planning and development history of Pentagon City that it is worth bringing to your attention with a number of recommendations. And I'm just going to take a quick look backwards. As you can see from this slide, there is also a report on this that's defined as attachment 10 in the work program report that'll go into greater detail, but I will try to cover it briefly tonight. The board members and planning commissioners know in 1976, Arlington adopted really one of our first master plans, preceded all of our sector plans. The Cafert's family, working with RTKL, the consultants, and a work group, a new master plan or phase development site plan was developed for Pentagon City. The slide on the left shows the open fields, if you will, that were mostly comprised of Pentagon Center. The area outlined in red in the center is the other PDSP that's property owned by Kimco, which was developed later. And again, in '76, Pentagon City was viewed in kind of a pioneering effort, if you will, as a new town in town. And it was defined as a foundation, really, for a long-term effort to build a new urban center with a dynamic mix of residential units, hotels, office, and retail establishments. And it's hard to argue that we haven't achieved that in part. And with the certainly commitment by Amazon to construct their new East Coast headquarters here in Pentagon City, that will have an equally as transformative effect in many ways. 2 years ago, planning staff recognized that growth would be coming and redevelopment would be on the horizon for some of the aging buildings and structures in Pentagon City, beyond the redevelopment of Met Park and Penn Place. Through some great work that Anthony Fuzzarelli and other staff produced, pretty much landmark document that takes a historical look back at where we've come from in Pentagon City, how we've achieved what we have today. And this is really a foundational piece and one that we'll be talking and using as a foundation as we begin to review the application later this year for Metropolitan Park. But again, it's an important document in terms sets the stage of what we'll talk about tonight. Today, Pentagon City is made up of, as you can see from this graphic and from the chart, of basically a series of parcels or blocks. As you can see from the left-hand column of the table, the current ownership of those blocks. And in the right-hand column, this is important, how much unbuilt density remains in Pentagon City. With the Penn Place parcel and the Met Park block, significant density remains, and that will again support HQ2 and the new elements of the Amazon development. But when you look at the remaining parcels, parcel 1C to the west of Penn Place, as well as the other parcels that form Pentagon Row, Fashion Center, very little density remains. Properties are essentially built out, and for the first time, we'll be looking at redevelopment in Pentagon City rather than new growth. So today, looking at where we are with Pentagon Center, we show the Metropolitan Park and Penn Place blocks where Amazon will shortly begin their plan review process with the Planning Commission and County Board as number 1 and 2. I've included the L-Core redevelopment of the Verizon site. While this is in Crystal City, it's on the 12th Street corridor. And I just want to emphasize how much of this potential new growth will really center on that important corridor where our new bus service and other investments will be made to support that growth connected with Amazon HQ2. 4 is the southern towers that are the Brookfield property. Again, these buildings will become vacant, I believe, in the spring of '20 when TSA exits the property. There will be a need to redevelop. We now have a application for a PDSP amendment that we're reviewing. 5 is the corner of Fashion Center. It's where the Macy's building is, at Army Navy Drive and Hayes Street. We've had discussions with Simon, the owner of Pentagon Center, for a couple of years, and most recently they are coming back to us with a focus on potential redevelopment of this corner property along Army Navy Drive, and really the center anchors 12th Street. We've also had discussions with the Fashion Center, with Federal Realty Investment Trust, and again, there is interest there in also proceeding with redevelopment. But again, the properties for Brookfield, Pentagon Center, but Fashion Center, and Pentagon Row, again, very little density left. It will require a redevelopment scheme. I've also shown the River House property labeled as number 6, where there have been a number of proposals by the prior owner and recently by JBG to provide a significant amount of new residential growth. Again, just to highlight what the intensity, the type and location of growth that may occur within the PDSP. It's led us to think about what are the alternative approaches to focusing on the review of this future development. One approach is certainly to take an incremental approach on a block-by-block basis to look at the Lincoln Brookfield site independently and wait till the other applications come in. Again, what we will not have in that process is an overall growth guidance in terms of both capacity analysis as well as various urban design and urban form parameters that we have with Penn Place and Met Park today. There's a potential for a consolidated review of of 2 of these applications. A third alternative is to look at all of the parcels that I've described along the 12th Street corridor together. And another alternative would be more comprehensive, and this would be staff's recommendation to also consider the River House property as well. While outside of the phase development site plan, the level of potential future growth there has a strong relationship, again, to the PDSP. So again, we've considered a number of alternative approaches. In terms of planning how we would approach a more comprehensive approach to updating the PDSP, again, it would have a foundation in a large part that's built on that history of growth and build out in the Pentagon City that we discussed earlier. We would define some planning and growth objectives, evaluate the study area alternatives, and these are the elements that I've covered in the work program report. In terms of staffing, we will need to make a new commitment, and there'll be some trade-offs in terms of projects and staffing, in terms of how we would provide that commitment. Most importantly, there will be a significant need for professional services. That's not budgeted today. And while each of the individual property owners of their applications would certainly be providing those types of detailed reviews, staff would recommend that we consider a different approach. We've not done this yet in Arlington, but to require the developers and property owners to proportionally contribute to this comprehensive study that will look at capacity, look at growth options, develop a new set of development and design guidelines that would be in place for the next decade or more for Pentagon City. And of course, there would be an extensive engagement and community process involved with this. We've outlined this in a very general way in our early report, but there is a great deal of work to prepare for this. But most importantly, if we proceed with this effort, it will require us to reallocate some of our staff resources. There are several projects that we'll need to consider to further prioritize, or some trade-offs that we need to put in place. And secondly, we'll need the commitment from those property owners to support financially this important new chapter in planning for Pentagon City. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to stop there, and I know there are going to be a number of questions in more detail about the importance of this new project and program item, and I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Duffy. Let's have at it, colleagues. Ms. Crystal.
So I'll begin just by expressing my strong support for this. Whatever conflicts and points of view may emerge during a planning process, I think the idea that we should have an updated plan is, I hope, is about as close to universal as you'll get. So I'm strongly supportive, and I'm actually quite supportive of, Mr. Duffy, what you were saying at the end with the proposal of asking developers, property owners, and other interested parties to contribute to the professional services. Just want to confirm, however, Arlington County government will still do the hiring and hold the contracts for any professional services engaged, correct?
Yes. We have done some research on this since it's a new approach for us. But we work closely with another Northern Virginia community who has done this routinely, and where the staff has been totally responsible for the scope. There's been a memorandum of agreement developed, an account to accept these funds, and to ensure that that scope, staffing, and the delivery of products and so forth would be through the county. But again, it's going to require what I would call a memorandum of agreement between all the parties. We've discussed this with the county attorney's office. We have a model that we think would be applicable here. But one thing I just want to add, there will be a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of foundational work over the next several months to prepare for this planning effort. We'll need agreement from the property owners. We'll need to provide a much greater degree, much higher level of scope of work for this that we can all agree on. I've talked about a memorandum agreement, a legal document that will bind us and ensure the things that you just mentioned, that ensure that the community understands that we'll be leading this effort. We'll need to procure professional services, and most importantly, develop a significant community engagement and involvement process. This is something we had not anticipated. We prepared for it, and we've been considering it. But again, given the level of growth and interest, this is the time.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that. And as you finalize a potential MOU, or at least begin to approach partners, I'm sure you're already considering this, but whatever additional best practices we can learn from the other jurisdiction you mentioned or beyond, or just in conversations with community stakeholders, the more we can do to really create not only the perception but the reality that this is an unbiased process, and that we appreciate the development community contributing to the cost of such a process, but that in no way prejudges an outcome, I think will be really important.
Thank you for that. That is going to be front and center. But again, while we've had discussions with major property owners about this approach, we're going to have to dig in more detail with them in the coming weeks. So, but that is going to be front and center.
Thank you, Mr. Gutschall.
On the study, both for the 12th Street corridor and the PDSP update, we know the PDSP is essentially the donut with the hole in the middle being Pentagon Center PDSP. And what I'm interested in is that hole in the donut and how that relates to. Are we anticipating that we are going to just leave the hole completely separate and out, or it will be incorporated into planning, at least so that everything planned around is done in the context of what's in the middle? We will consider the approvals that Kimco currently has. As you know, their residential tower is nearing completion. They have another residential phase that
They will be bringing back with some site plan amendments. But the balance of that redevelopment depends on Costco. And so we don't foresee redevelopment of that part of the Pentagon Center PDSP in the immediate horizon, but the plan that's approved will provide the planning context in part. If there are some conclusions that come out of the study that may have some influence on that other PDSP, we'll have to consider those at that time.
I certainly recognize that the balance of that plan is dependent on Costco, and I think that, as I recall in the last amendment there was, discussion that Costco had a rather long-term lease, so we were looking at further out. But it seems if Kimco has interest in doing something substantially different than what was they're already entitled to there, it would seem like as part of this process now would be the time for them to get involved in the conversation, because in particular, at the last time that we visited this, when I was on the Planning Commission, I don't think it was at all, and certainly obviously not anticipated while we knew Met Park was coming and Penn Place, it was not anticipated Amazon was coming, something of that caliber and weight and that change. And in particular, though, I also think there was, because I remember the discussions about the TSA site, and that was looked at as, well, that's not really ever going to change, and now we know that it is. And so there's a lot of moving parts, and while I know Costco has we can't force Kimco to come to the table, I certainly hope that we would invite them to participate in whatever processes that we're outlining here, because it would be a shame to have the hole in the donut just be a donut hole. Right, exactly.
Donut holes are delicious.
We are actually meeting with Kimco in the next 10 days, and we plan on having that conversation. So as we finalize the work program scope, we'll be reporting back on what that relationship will be.
Mr. DeFerranti.
Thank you. I guess I'd like to just sort of make a couple of big picture questions and thoughts, starting with slide 17. I mean, I want to start by echoing Ms. Crystal and Mr. Gutschall's broad support for bringing this to us. This seems strategic and the right way to be approaching this. As far as signals, you kind of laid out a couple of alternative scenarios, and I guess, and there will be plenty of details to come, but from my side at least, the broader, as sort of the first, you identify the properties in this one, and then as you get to 19, you have a sort of a broader scope. And I think you kind of looked at a little bit to make sure that we're in support of that. I'm wholly supportive of the broadest scope possible. With respect to the space and the red line you have there. That's one thought. The other is just want to confirm, in the materials for this, the report, page 36, you talk about and not in the presentation, but you talk about the various items that could be part of this. And am I right that, that level of detail would probably come back to us once you get into a memorandum of agreement and a little later down the road?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then last, I just think it bears repeating, because reading the report, there are so many properties that are involved here, so I think it's important to see. I don't know that in work sessions we've talked about all the Brookfield site and some of these other sites, and just as I was reading through the materials, the board report, I think it's important to stress that balance, that it is really about all of the stakeholders and all of the space, and not just Amazon, because we have Brookfield, we have so many things going on that I think it is very much the responsible approach to be trying to seek contributions for this, so I'm wholly in support.
Thank you. So I'll just, Ms. Garvey, go ahead.
I'll just simply, put in my 2 cents, 5 cents, and I completely agree with what everybody's been saying. I mean, it's just, I think as Ms. Crystal said, it just makes sense to do everything at once in a holistic picture. That is common sense. Having the developers help us handle that financially also makes sense, because otherwise we can't do it. And I guess moving forward, at some point, I would probably like a I don't know if it's a briefing session or more discussion of some of the things that we're not doing and we're postponing, because some of them make me more uncomfortable. Some of them give me more heartburn than others. And I would, appreciate an opportunity to kind of talk through some of that. So I'm hoping maybe we can do some, we're doing some out-of-the-box thinking on how we're handling this PDSP. Maybe we can do a little out-of-the-box thinking on some of these items as well.
We will
Thank you.
definitely do that, and we'll be reporting back quite often as we make progress on this.
Thank you, and I will add my 2 cents. I think obviously something that I've long wanted to see, but also just wanted to put my vote in unless it was unclear for the expanded study area boundaries. I think that's absolutely the right approach moving forward. My question really picks up on something that Ms. Crystal brought up, and it's really about the procurement and who we ultimately foresee being the universe of folks who would provide those professional services. And in my mind, at least, given the size of this, the nature of some of the property owners, both current and future involved, that this would be an attractive thing for the best and brightest professional services firms to work on. So are we envisioning anything as part of this procurement where we can have some sort of a solicitation that brings the best and the brightest to work on this project?
We will definitely be committed to do that. What that process is something that we'll have to work with purchasing as well as the county attorney on. Again, that procurement process, as you know, can take time. We want to find an approach to this to allow us to go after the best and brightest, and there will be many firms who will look for this opportunity. But we want to make sure they're right for Arlington, they're the right fit, and we can do this in a reasonable time frame. Sometimes these RFP processes can be extensive. We will have to spend some time with county staff and work this through. And we've had some early discussion with the county attorney's office. And again, there is some real heavy foundational work, as I've said before, that staff will need to do. We've thought about how we can reallocate some of our resources to work with me on this, but this is so important that we'll be committed to it, and we will put together the best team that we can.
I appreciate that, and if it ever gets to the point where we're making trade-offs about the quality of the team versus the time to get something, I would at least welcome having a further conversation with the 5 of us about the nature of that trade-off before we just go ahead and commit to it. Once it gets to the purchasing standpoint, we're out of it. So, we're not going to inject ourselves in it. But to the point at which that becomes something that you're concerned with, we'd like to know about it as early as possible so we can weigh in.
Again, Mr. Chair, given the extensive work that we'll have on our plate over the next several months on a number of these fronts, again, we'll be reporting back progress to the manager periodically. So we'll be committed to that, certainly.
Thank you. Mr. Schroll, Ms. Guerin?
As I mentioned previously, I think we're relatively supportive of the broader scope of the boundaries. Certainly want to consider all the sites at once and not in the piecemeal approach. I think we do welcome the ability to have some additional professional expertise. Obviously, the nuances of how the county navigates that is sort of beyond our scope, but we would certainly, I think, welcome additional resources at the table. Commissioner Guerin, do you want to?
Likewise, we're very excited about this, and as I said before, about any opportunities in the county where we have the chance to work with staff and re-examine some of the visions, especially in areas where the planning documents are very old. Yeah, we're excited about hearing about the makeup of the group and the scope of the project. We agree also that it should be as broad as possible. I think that's a question that you raised early on, and our community is getting increasingly dense. We have fewer opportunities for land, and this is a really good opportunity to look at how we might address some of those in keeping with our recently adopted plans and policies. And while we don't have a public facilities comp plan element yet, we do have a lot of need for spaces that can accommodate those uses. So it'd be really interesting to see what we come up with.
I think the only other thing that I forgot to mention is I would like to kind of concur with what Ms. Crystal mentioned about not having this process kind of presume the outcome before it starts, and so to make sure that it's sort of an open process and one that can be open to all the stakeholders at the beginning and not be kind of presupposed. So we would concur with that sentiment.
Good. All right, so I do believe those are the two elements that you wanted to present to us. So at this point, really, what would be in order are any elements of the work program, work plan, future activities that we've not surfaced through our guided discussion thus far, starting with Mr. Gutschall.
I actually just wanted to take the opportunity to perhaps second, if you will, the Planning Commission's request that we sort of go back to having this conversation a little bit sooner in the cycle. I think we talked about earlier tonight about it'd be nice to know when we look at what is on our plate in terms of zoning ordinance amendments, for example, and recognizing then what staffing resources we might want to put towards. I know it's probably 6 1, half dozen the other in terms of pick your poison. You do it a little earlier, and then there's aspects to that maybe aren't as ideal. But for me personally, I think having this conversation sooner rather than later would be desirable.
Sounds good. Ms. Crystal.
Just in closing, I know we're always looking for things to take off your plate. So on page 29 of the work plan, that penthouse study at the direction of the board actually predates any of your current board members. So we could free up a space in the parking lot. So joking aside, just thank you all very much for your work. I think this work session is always an opportunity for us to truly understand the full scope of what your team is doing. We appreciate it tremendously, and I think it's really strikingly a mix of both the most urgent priorities facing our community and also ensuring that we do what planning does best, which is have a vision for the long run as well. So thank you.
Well, again, let me emphasize again the quality, professionalism, and the commitment of your planning team. Again, I'm very fortunate to work with some outstanding professionals every day. And again, this work program has been developed with them, and they'll be fully engaged. So again, our community should be very pleased that we have the team that we do.
Thank you. All right. Ms. Garvey.
I actually was going to be right there, too. I think we have an incredible team. It's just really watching everybody we're all wearing. I mean, it feels like we're in a real different place than we've been, and I kind of feel like the team is together like just in time, because we've got a lot going. And that includes we've got a lot of residents and folks here from Crystal City who are active and helping us out, and other commissioners. So this is a real exciting time. It's a new team forming, and I think we're just about to gel, and we're going to have a really good game, I think. It's going to be exciting. Thanks.
So, yeah, I'll just say for my part, certainly all the thanks, and, do want to echo the recognition of the various people who've come to take part in these proceedings passively this evening, members of our Planning Commission, other commissions, as well as members of the public and county staff. When you look at all of the stuff that's in the work program, and, at whatever point you consider it discretionary or not, these are all priorities for us, and it's a pretty ambitious, impressive agenda, a scope of work that we're involved in, some meaningful things that I think are going to be very much a part of the fabric of Arlington moving forward. I do want to identify, and this is not a conclusive list, please add to it. I just want to make sure that we walk away with some clear takeaways of what we've determined tonight. So there's general support for the approach and the trade-offs that have been outlined by staff. Nothing generally that we consider to be soul-crushing, with the possible exception of making sure that we preserve some of that tracking, reporting, figuring out how to continue that. There is a desire to further the conversation during the year, if not necessarily deliver the concrete deliverables on long-range facility planning, with a focus on how to deal with that schools issue, which is not only going to be something that is in the planning division, but I think, quite frankly, it's really going to be at the level of working with the APS leadership to really figure out what the way forward is there. And then for our big picture, big piece of the agenda, I think we've got some clarity on what we'd like to do with the Pentagon City PDSP. We want this to be as expanded as possible, including areas that may not necessarily be scheduled for redevelopment or slated for redevelopment for decades into the future, but making sure they're not systematically excluded, but invited to participate. and that we try to the extent possible to invite all talent who can contribute to our doing the study meaningfully. But at the very, very core, we are making sure that we are bringing robust, unbiased expertise to this conversation, and that I think we all very much second, third, and fourth the idea that the development community pays for this. We trust staff can structure it in such a way that does preserve the idea that this is not a developer bought and paid for study. That we can deal with, but certainly the very idea that considering the circumstances that we're looking at, that we would have the development community participate in some of the costs. And by no means are they going to pay for the whole thing. We're going to be committing substantial amounts of resources to this. It's just paying a fair share, for lack of a better term. And this is something that is done in many other places, so I know that we'll do it right. Any other big things that I'm missing in terms of a takeaway? Mr. Duffy, Mr. Williamson, is there anything else you needed to take from this conversation tonight that we haven't discussed?
We have some clear direction to move forward. Thank you. And thanks to the Planning Commission again for continuing to be our partner in these important projects.
With that, everybody gets 15 extra minutes of their life back. We're adjourned.